We're good. So, hello everyone. We are coming in for our President's video, which would have been June, but now it's July, so we'll go ahead and count it as July, so we won't do another one this month. So we'll go ahead and count it as this month's. So for our next president, the last one that we had hit was uh, President Truman. Unfortunately, I have seemingly lost my little placard of presidents at the moment. I can't seem to find where I put it, so hopefully I'll have by the time we do the next video. But for today's president, we are going to be covering Mr. Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower, I the only portrait I can get of him up close is we actually have him on a former coin that we used to have here in the United States. He used to be on a dollar coin back in the 70s. So we'll see a better picture of him here in a moment. So, Dwight Eisenhower is going to be the 34th president of the United States. He is going to be the first Republican president in 20 years. Mind you, that in the presidents so far, we've not had, because FDR served 4 terms, well, died during this 4th term, and then Harry Truman ended up getting his own term on his own right. There has not been, at this point in the president series, there's not been a Republican in the White House for about 20 years at this point. It's been since 1933. And that's going to change with Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is, in my general opinion, he is a good president. I don't think he was absolutely, like outstanding, but I do feel that he was a very strong president for going into the first stage of the Cold War. He, in many ways, I feel is a lot better of a man than, say, individuals like Nixon or Lyndon Johnson, who are going to come later on, and he is going to be one that is pivotal in American history during the crucial decade of the 1950s, going into that first full decade of the Cold War. So, as we always go through with these videos, we go a little bit into their life before they go into the presidency, and then we kind of delve into the presidency itself, and then any events that might have happened after they left office, which with Eisenhower is going to be relatively short because he doesn't get much of a retirement. So going into this, we have to take the clock back to when Eisenhower was born to start this off. And Eisenhower was born in 1890, on October 14th of 1890, in the town of Denison, Texas. He was one of the many children of David and Ida Eisenhower, and he would also be the last president who was born in the 19th century. Every president since Dwight Eisenhower was born after 1900, starting with John F. Kennedy, who was born in 1917. So he is the last of the presidents born in the 18th century, not the 18th, the 19th century, the 1800s. In 1892, when Dwight was only 2 years old, his family ended up moving from the town of Denison, Texas, and instead moved to Abilene, Kansas, which would become the town that Eisenhower would associate as his hometown in his older life. He would grow up along with his brothers, going by the nickname of Ike. Him and his brothers all went by this nickname as kids, but eventually he was the only one that was still being called Ike by the time that he was a full-grown adult. During his youth, Dwight would develop an appreciation for the outdoors. He learned about hunting, fishing, cooking, and card playing from a neighbor who often would camp alongside one of the nearby rivers. And he would also read his mother's history books. And through those history books, Eisenhower developed a very keen interest in military history. It fascinated him from a very young age, which I think you can kind of guess why this might be going. Eisenhower is, yes, a very big military man. That is what he gets into the White House from, is his military record. So after graduating high school in 1909, Eisenhower would express a desire to attend West Point. However, his desire to go into the U.S. military was not entirely a good one seen by his mother. His mother was a very devout Christian, and she believed that war was wicked and evil, and there was no point of it. She did not like the idea of her son going into the military, knowing that he may one day be called to fight. And she did not approve of his decision to go to West Point by any means, but she also did not really stop him either. So in 1911, Eisenhower was admitted to West Point Military Academy in New York. He would graduate in the middle of his class in 1915 as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army, and he would immediately request an assignment to go to the Philippines, which was automatically denied to him as they weren't really keen on sending a fresh new recruit from West Point out to a region of the United States territorial holdings that was still somewhat shaky because it had not even been 10 years since the Filipino guerrilla war had ended with the native Filipinos. And they weren't really keen on sending a fresh recruit from West Point out there. Instead, the Army would station Eisenhower at Fort Sam Houston and San Antonio, Texas, due to the ongoing Mexican Revolution that had kicked off in 1910 and was starting to see violence spill over the U.S.-Mexican border. So they kind of basically came to the conclusion, no, we're not going to send you to the Philippines, but we have a kind of a border issue going on right now, so we're going to send you to Texas, which you're familiar with anyway. You were born there. While in Texas, Eisenhower would meet the love of his life. He would meet Mamie Doud of Boone, Iowa, and he would propose to Mamie on Valentine's Day of 1916. Now, the couple originally planned to marry that November of 1916, but seeing that the tide of war, World War I in Europe, was starting to kind of go in a way that might end up bringing about American involvement, they correctly guessed that America would at some point probably get involved in the war, and fearing that it would be by that November, the Eisenhowers instead pushed the date to July 1st, anticipating that by November there may be a war. That didn't happen, but it did happen that following April. So they were right in guessing we would get involved, not quite right on the timing, but because of the estimation that Eisenhower may be sent off to war, they moved up their wedding date a bit. They would end up having two sons from their marriage, Dowd, who would die of scarlet fever at only age 3, and the other son who did make it to adulthood, John. Now, when the United States would enter World War I in 1917, in that April, when the United States declared war, Eisenhower would request an overseas assignment. He wanted in on the war effort. He wanted to make a name for himself in the Army. Again, his assignment request was denied, and he was instead sent to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and then to Camp Meade in Maryland in 1918. He would later command a unit that would train tank crews in Camp Colt, Pennsylvania. Now, Eisenhower, at the very end of the year, almost did get his wish to get deployed to Europe and actually engage in the fighting there. He almost got his wish when his unit was ordered to deploy to France in late 1918. However, just a week before they were set to depart to go to France, the war ended. The armistice with Germany was signed and World War I was over just a week before he would have been sent over. Now, while many men may have seen that as, relief that they would not have to go over to Europe and fight this bloody war that was already the worst conflict that was seen in human history so far, Eisenhower was somewhat bummed out because he felt like this military experience in that war was what was going to make or break your future career advancement in the U.S. military. And he wasn't exactly wrong on that. Later in his life, many of his compatriots and comrades during World War II would chastise Ike at times, as he was called, because of his lack of military experience in the Great War, whereas they had fought in it and actually had military combat experience, even though it was none of Eisenhower's fault on his own. In 1919, Eisenhower was appointed to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and he would graduate first in his class of 245 cadets. He would then go on to serve as a military aide to General John J. Pershing, the American general who led the Expeditionary Force in World War I, and he would also serve as a military aide to General Douglas MacArthur, who would also become a fellow World War II general. He would actually be stationed with MacArthur in the Philippines, one of the places he had originally requested an assignment back in 1915, between 1935 and 1939, while serving on MacArthur's staff. So before we go further here is a picture of the home in Abilene, Kansas, where Eisenhower grew up after his family moved there in 1892. This was the home that he pretty much associated with as his childhood home, even though he had not been born there. It's still standing today. And then here we also have a picture of Eisenhower the year he graduated West Point in 1915. This is him upon his graduation at West Point as a second lieutenant. And here we have a picture of him and some army buddies in 1919, just a year after World War I ended. Ike, Ike is over here on the far right. Now, Eisenhower would end up returning home in 1939, and he would return home shortly after World War II had broke out in Europe with the Nazi German invasion of Poland. Now, mind you, the United States is not officially in World War II yet, as we have discussed many times. We don't get involved in World War II until we get bombed at Pearl Harbor, which is 2 years down the road in 1941. The United States is largely staying out of World War II prior to that. So 1939 and 1940, the United States is not really involved in the war. It's supplying arms, but not men and armies. He ends up getting promoted just before the United States gets drawn into World War II to brigadier general on October 3rd of 1941, so about 2 months before Pearl Harbor happened. Now, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, U.S. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall would call Eisenhower to Washington, D.C., in order to have him work as a planning officer for military operations. In November of 1942, Eisenhower would actually be put in charge to head the Allied invasion of North Africa in what was called Operation Torch, which would prove to be one of the first major actions of American troops in World War II, at least in Europe and in the Europe and North African theaters. He would also His success with Operation Torch and ousting the Germans out of North Africa would help secure him his command of the invasion of the island of Sicily and the Italian mainland in 1943 that would ultimately culminate that summer with the surrender of Italy and the removal of Benito Mussolini from the Italian government. Now, Eisenhower's success and his habit of sometimes advising his superiors when he felt their plans needed adjustment, and his free will to speak his mind when he felt it was needed, kind of helped convince President Roosevelt to appoint him as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. He liked Eisenhower's success that he had had. He had not really failed in any capacity compared to some of the other generals, and he liked that he was more than willing to speak his mind when he felt it needed to be done. He was not just going to take orders from his superior, even if and just follow blindly, even when he had personal reservations about some of the plans that they were telling him to fall through with. So President Roosevelt ends up appointing Eisenhower as the supreme commander of the Allied expeditionary forces in Europe in December of 1943. He would be in charge of spearheading the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe at Normandy, France, which would culminate in the D-Day invasion. More than 150,000 troops would land in France on D-Day, which was scheduled for June 6 of 1944, and by August 25th, Paris had been liberated, and the Allies were in the ascendancy in the West. The Soviets were coming in the East. It was now no longer a question of Nazi Germany would lose. It was a question of when would they give up. Which that war would continue, of course, until May of 1945, when Germany finally surrendered after Adolf Hitler's suicide. Eisenhower, by that time, had become a five-star general, one of the highest ranking a general can get in the army, and he returned home to serve as Army Chief of Staff late in 1945 after the war was complete in Europe. In 1948, Eisenhower would leave active combat duty. He would leave active duty in the American Army to become president of Columbia University in New York City. And in 1950, President Truman would actually ask Ike to command the newly organized military forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in Europe, of which Eisenhower obliged and took command of NATO's military forces. Now, this led into Ike's departure into politics. Before this, Ike had not really been a political man by any means. He had not really been heavily involved in politics. This wasn't his field. He had been a military man for most of his life. However, he was not afraid to speak his mind, as we said, when he felt that there were decisions made that weren't entirely of the best interest. For one, Eisenhower had been a person that had criticized President Truman's decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. He felt that it was overzealous, that it was unnecessary, and he didn't think that they served any other purpose rather than testing the horrible weapons. That was his personal opinion. And while he did maintain a largely good relationship with President Truman, later became clear to Truman that Eisenhower was somewhat a critic of his administration in some ways. And at the same time, he was also being courted by Republican politicians to possibly run for president in 1952, since Truman would not be running for another term. Now, Truman's popularity was already low due to the ongoing war in the Korean War, and the Republicans approached Eisenhower in 1952 about the possibility of having him run for president. He ended up winning the Republican primaries earlier that year, and he would then end up resigning his Army commission and return home in June of 1952, where he would formally accept the Republican nomination to run for president in 1952 at the party convention in July, which would utterly destroy a large part of the relationship that him and President Truman had at that point. They would later reconcile a bit, but Truman's saw it as kind of a betrayal that, they had somewhat been kind of, on good terms, and then Eisenhower went and threw his lot in with the opposing party. At the Republican National Convention that July, Eisenhower would select California Senator Richard Nixon, yes, that Richard Nixon, he was vice president before he was president, as his running mate to be vice president. He would defeat Democratic nominee Adlai Stevenson that year in a landslide election, which would lead to the first Republican victory in a presidential election since 1928. The 1952 presidential election results were as follows. There were 48 states in the Union at that time. Alaska and Hawaii were still territories up until the end of the 1950s. So there were a total of 531 electoral votes. You needed a majority of 266 of those votes in order to get a win. Eisenhower won 442 of the electoral votes needed, while his opponent only took 89. The popular vote was very much in Eisenhower's favor. He took 55.2% of the popular vote compared to Stevenson's 44.3%, and Eisenhower would capture 39 out of the 48 states, with Stevenson only winning the remaining 9. So Eisenhower has been officially elected as the 34th President of the United States, and he will take office for his first term on January 20th of 1953. So here we have a picture of Eisenhower during his time as a general in World War II. This is 1942, so this is about the time that he's heading Operation Torch in North Africa. This is him during the war. Trying to think of what. Here we have a very famous portrait that I think many of us have seen of Eisenhower, even if we haven't realized he was in it. We have a picture of him addressing the troops the day before D-Day, before the day before the landing on June 6th. This would have been about June 5th or 4th of 1944 that this picture was taken of him addressing the troops before they make that pivotal world-changing invasion that would ultimately lead to the defeat of Nazism. Here we have a picture of Eisenhower and some of the other American generals right after the Germans surrendered in May of 1945 at Reims. So this is right after the Germans have signed the surrender. And here we have a picture of Eisenhower in his term as president of Columbia University, where he's lighting the Yule log for the holidays in that capacity. And then here we have the electoral map depicting the results of the 1952 presidential election, of which Eisenhower, like I said, he took a landslide victory. He even won some states in the heavily Democratic South at that time, including Texas, Florida, and Tennessee, and Virginia, states that normally voted Democrat, and they actually went Republican in 1952. So Eisenhower, as we said, he will begin his first term of office on January 20th of 1953. Eisenhower would brand himself as a progressive conservative going into the presidency, as he sought to continue all of the major New Deal programs that were still in operation up to that point. He was not in the manner of wanting to reinstate any that had already been, you know, gotten rid of and dissolved, but he was in the manner of actually wanting to basically continue the ones that still existed, mostly like ones like Social Security, of which he was a big supporter. He would actually help to expand Social Security by creating the Department of Health. Eisenhower would also see the Korean War as a stalemate, which it was, and he agreed as part of the 1952 campaign that upon him taking office that he would seek to withdraw the United States and end the Korean War immediately, which there was an armistice signed to end the Korean War in March of 1953. So right within 2 months of him taking office, the war in Korea is done. Now, at home, Eisenhower would face a hysteria against communism in the government. This is during the height of the Cold War. Now, while Soviet leader Joseph Stalin did die the year that Eisenhower took office, ironically, the same month that the Korean War ended, and this led to a semi thaw in Soviet American relations, they were still rather high in terms of animosity. And there was a fear in the United States of, communists at home. And as we discussed in the last video, one senator who really epitomed this, Red Scare was Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, who led a crusade in Congress to basically find any citizens or any senators and government officials that he claimed were supposed communists and had communist ties. They were communist spies. And he is looking to accuse almost anyone that he can get his hands on. The problem is, McCarthy made many of these accusations without actually having any evidence to back them up, and mostly it was a way for him to go after his political enemies. And in the process, McCarthy would his anti-communist crusade would end up violating many citizens' civil liberties in the process. Eisenhower would say nothing publicly about McCarthy, but he privately voiced his intense dislike of the senator and ended up helping to actually orchestrate his downfall within the Republican Party itself. Eisenhower would also take moves to further civil rights for African Americans, such as in 1954, just a year into his first term, the Supreme Court would rule in the pivotal case of Brown versus Board of Education that school segregation was unconstitutional and that schools should be integrated and that public schools in the United States should be integrated. Eisenhower would support the court's decision, but he voiced his opinion that desegregation should be done slowly and not like all at once, fearing what reaction would come about from the whites in the country, specifically in the very segregationist South, if they tried to forcibly integrate the schools instantly, which eventually we'll have to come back to that issue because that will come back to play another role in his second term. Now, Eisenhower may have pulled American troops from Korea, but he did not forget the ongoing Cold War. He was very staunchly opposed to communism, just like his predecessor, President Truman, had been. And he believed in massive defensive spending to deter Soviet aggression. The U.S. under Eisenhower's presidency would build up its nuclear stockpile. The nuclear arms race was fully on in the 1950s as the public was fascinated with the possibilities of nuclear power, but at the same time, a rising awareness of what these weapons could do if ever actually used in war. So the US builds up its nuclear stockpile, and Eisenhower is a very big user of using the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to perform covert operations around the world in order to advance American interests around the globe. CIA led coups would end up toppling governments that had been viewed by the United States as hostile in both Iran in 1953 and in Guatemala in 1954. They would also work to supply munitions and supplies to the French forces in Indochina, which is now like Cambodia and Vietnam, but opted not to send airstrikes to help prevent a French defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which would kind of end up coming to backfire on us because the Vietnamese would win their independence from France with this battle in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. But at the United Nations, it would partition Vietnam between a North and a South, a communist regime in the North and an anti communist regime in the South. And they were supposed to have a referendum the following year over uniting the country under one government. Unfortunately, the problem came about that the United States wasn't about to let a communist country just willingly have a communist government just willingly take over, a new country that was about to be formed, and we meddled about what we shouldn't have. It was during Eisenhower's presidency that the United States formally began supporting the anti-communist government of South Vietnam, which will eventually lead us in just about 10 years after Eisenhower's presidency in the 1960s to getting involved in the Vietnam War. So it was during Eisenhower's presidency that we really actually start to actively have a presence in Vietnam. It would be expanded under President Kennedy, and then Johnson would take it to a whole nother level, which we'll discuss in the coming video. That's going to be a major issue that's going to come up. In 1955, Eisenhower would meet with British, French, and Soviet leaders at Geneva, Switzerland, to propose a open skies policy of inspecting each other's military programs in order to kind of promote, get rid of the suspicion of each other and maybe promote some kind of peace. The Soviets would deny and basically absolutely refuse to partake in any kind of a program of this matter, and the talks ended up collapsing. Eisenhower would also work to strengthen NATO, and he would also create SEATO, which would combat communist expansion in Southeast Asia. Now, SEATO would fall apart, unlike NATO. By 1977, SEATO had actually been abolished and disbanded. It just never worked on the way that NATO did, but its original purpose was very similar to NATO in the Southeast Asia region. So that brings us to 1956. So in 1956, Eisenhower would voice what is going to become one of his most important domestic projects that he will endure during his presidency, that has endured to the present day, and that he is going to voice his desire for an interstate highway system in the United States. He argued that this would both improve transportations for civilians, while at the same time it would also help the United States to have defense readiness at the same time and make it easier to get military assets from one end of the country to the other. The modern interstate highway system saw its birth during Eisenhower's presidency, and the highway system that he would create would construct over 41,000 miles of roads, which would be the largest public works program in American history. And that interstate highway system has only gotten bigger since the 1950s, as we can probably guess by today's size of our highway systems. In February of 1956, Eisenhower decided that he would run for a second term, despite previously thinking that he was not going to and thinking against it. The questions loomed, however, over his health, since just the year prior, in 1955, Eisenhower had actually suffered a heart attack and had come out of it, but there were questions over if his health was declining and could he really actually serve another term without dying. Now, Eisenhower campaigned very vigorously in 1956 to try to alleviate the public's fear of that, and he successfully managed to do that. He alleviated any fears of the public that his health was on the decline and any concerns over his physical fitness to maintain the office of the presidency. Democrats were actually so in belief that Eisenhower was so popular that they knew almost exactly that there was no chance hardly that Eisenhower was going to be beaten in 1956 for his reelection. And so they simply renominated Adlai Stevenson to face him again in a rematch, knowing that Stevenson probably stood very little chance of actually getting it. Now, as the election neared, Eisenhower got another small victory to help him toward re-election with the Suez Crisis that broke out on October 29th, just about a week before the election actually happened. And the Suez Crisis ended up coming about in Egypt. The Egyptian President Nasser had actually tried to take control of the Suez Canal from Britain and France, nationalize it as an Egyptian asset. Britain and France did not like this at all, and they threatened to invade unless Nasser gave it back. And they tried to get the United States in, and the United States like, no, we're not really for helping you maintain this canal because that's kind of Egypt's property. Basically, when the weakening of France and Britain that occurred after World War II, the United States didn't see much of a purpose of defending British and French interests in the canal. So the United States kind of sides with Nasser in this whole debacle, and Eisenhower tells Britain and France that if you invade Egypt over this, I will not support you, and I will forcibly try to get you out if needed. They end up going against Eisenhower's wishes. Britain and France do invade Egypt, but due to Eisenhower pressuring them, they end up leaving very, very soon after. And Egypt ultimately comes out on top of this. The British and the French are humiliated on the world stage. They end up losing their control of the Suez Canal, and it goes in Egypt's favor eventually. Eisenhower, during the whole process, had been able to keep from deploying American troops into the conflict, and this definitely boosted his public image going to that week before the election, at which he would win his reelection in a landslide. The 1956 election results, they were again 266 votes. that would be needed out of the 531 to secure the presidency. Eisenhower got a lead of 457 of those votes, with Stevenson taking only 73. The popular vote was actually more in Eisenhower's favor at this time. He took 57.4% of the popular vote compared to Stevenson's 42, and Eisenhower would win 41 states this time instead compared to Stevenson's 7. So he actually won approximately two more states than he had 4 years earlier, of which here is the image of that electoral map from 1956. So Kentucky ended up going for him, and so did West Virginia, are the two states that he ended up gaining. Now, in the aftermath of the 1956 election and the Suez Crisis, Eisenhower would announce the Eisenhower Doctrine. And this doctrine was that any country in the Middle East could request at any given time economic assistance or military aid from the United States. Of course, that would be heavily used by certain countries, such as Iran, by the Shah, and that would lead into a whole nother thing, which will eventually, I think we're going to cover him here pretty soon with the Iranian Revolution, because it's very pivotal to what's going on, what just transpired within the past couple weeks and going into the future. And I think that's something we need to cover, is how Iran got in its current state. And that kind of also stems to Eisenhower's presidency in a way, with the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime back in the 50s. So maybe that will be our next video. We might talk about that for next week, going into that. Maybe connect it a little bit here. So that is going to be a defining thing. That's when the United States really starts to get involved in the Middle East, is the 1950s during Eisenhower's presidency. And I mean, given your political views, you can argue over how well that's worked. I, in my opinion, think it's been a disaster. We need to get out of there. We have no business in the Middle East. It's not our playground. And that would lead to his second term. So Eisenhower will start his second term in 1957. And that very year, the whole thing with integration in public schools is going to come back to be an issue. Resistance to desegregation in the public schools had been worsening since the Supreme Court's decision in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, but especially in the South, it had only gotten more vehement, and even the governors were starting to defy the Supreme Court's order and say that they were under no circumstances going to allow the integration of black students into white schools in their respective states. Eisenhower was very reluctant to heed the calls that he was starting to get to use the president's authority to enforce the desegregation and to enforce the Supreme Court's order, which he had the power to do, but he also knew that it was unprecedented, and he really didn't know if he wanted to set that example by using federal troops to enforce, letting these students go to school. He ultimately relented and argued that these states were going in violation of what had been deemed constitutional law, so he ended up sending federal troops to enforce integration at Little Rock High School in September of 1957, as there were 9 black students who had been previously barred from entering the school, including by an assembled crowd at its front doors, including Arkansas's own governor. And he ended up sending the federal troops in to forcibly allow these students to go to school. And these troops didn't just escort them to school; like, they stayed with them inside the school building throughout the day to make sure that they were protected. Eisenhower would also sign several civil rights legislation acts in both 1957 and 1960, which would provide protection for black voters. So not on the lines of Kennedy, but more on the lines of he's starting to tip toward the civil rights movement in ways that predecessors had not. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution would be another major event in foreign policy during Eisenhower's presidency, as it saw the overthrow of the pro American military dictator Fulgencio Batista in the neighboring island nation of Cuba. And a communist regime would be established there under the infamous Fidel Castro, which would nationalize American property, specifically sugar plantations on the island that absolutely outraged American government officials and American business leaders. Eisenhower would actually begin directing the CIA to begin looking for ways to depose Castro almost immediately, which would end up culminating in 1961 with Bay of Pigs invasion, which would actually take place under President John F. Kennedy, and that would absolutely fail, but it had been Eisenhower's brainchild. In 1957, the Soviets would launch the first man made satellite into orbit. So, this was 2 years before the Cuban Revolution, but it's something that is very important going into the second part of Eisenhower's presidency because the launch of this first man made satellite that the Soviets did, what they called Sputnik, would essentially kick off what we know now as the space race, the race to get to the moon and the race for space exploration. The Soviets had a very commanding lead because up until this point, the Americans had no idea how sophisticated the Soviets' space technology was becoming, and they rapidly discovered otherwise that now they had the capability of launching a man made satellite. So the discovery that the Soviets obviously had this ability to launch a man-made satellite obviously terrified the American people, and Eisenhower responded to this almost immediately. Within a year, in 1958, Eisenhower would officially establish what would become NASA. And that obviously NASA is to this day one of the ongoing American space exploration agency in the United States and one of the most important space agencies in the world, and Eisenhower was responsible for creating that in response to Sputnik just the year prior. So in 1958, NASA ends up getting created. Eisenhower's final year in office would see relations deteriorate between the United States and the Soviet Union even further, with two events that end up coming about. First one that comes about ends up involving China, communist China, which had become communist in 1950. Well, not 1950, 1949. I apologize for the year mistake. He would intervene. The United States, under Eisenhower's direction, would intervene in the Taiwan crisis of 1960, where it seemed as if the communist government in mainland China was getting ready to invade the nationalist regime that had fled to the island of Taiwan in 1949, and it looked as though they were getting ready to actually abolish that. The United States had continued to acknowledge the former nationalist regime as the legitimate government of China, and thus they did not recognize the communist regime in Beijing. They instead recognized the regime in Taipei, which still exists to this day. It's honestly astonishing that they've managed to survive for so long. But part of that comes from Eisenhower's doing, because when this comes about in 1960, Eisenhower actually threatened to use nuclear weapons on China if they should invade Taiwan. Basically, we ended up signing a treaty with Taiwan that obligated that should China invade it, that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense, and that kind of convinced the communists to back off for the time being. But at the same time, it made the People's Republic of China realize that we need nuclear weapons of our own because we don't have the United States just threatened us with nuclear weapons if we invaded, and the reason we backed off is because we don't have any of our own to counter them with. So they end up backing off, but it also kickstarts the Chinese nuclear weapons program in 1960 with that event. The thing that would really crush relations with the Soviet Union, however, now China at that time is going to hurt Soviet relations because of the factor that China at this point is still a major Soviet ally, and that is going to sour relations. But the big one that's going to really have an impact is going to happen also that year with the spy plane incident. Now, there have been cordial relations, as I said, between the United States and the Soviets for most of the 1950s. Yes, they were engaged in an arms race. Yes, they were competing on the world stage. But since the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, relations had somewhat cooled. With the new Soviet leader of Nikita Khrushchev, they had gone to a relatively placid, amicable relationship. However, this would change when the Soviets ended up shooting down an American spy plane. They ended up shooting down a U-2 spy plane over Soviet airspace in 1960, and initially, when presenting this to the United States and to the United Nations, the United States absolutely denied that this was even their spy plane. They're like, "This ain't ours," because the protocol was that if one of these U-2 pilots ever got shot down, they were to kill themselves to prevent the enemy from finding out, where they were from or what nation they were flying for or whatever else. So they thought the pilots killed themselves. There's no way that they can prove that it was our spy plane or not. So the United States at first denies the Soviet claims that we've shot down an American spy plane over our country. And only to get flabbergasted when the Soviets later produce the pilot, who is still alive and has told them everything, along with the wreckage of his aircraft, which is actually on display, I believe, in either St. Petersburg or Moscow to this day. So that ends up dramatically shifting the Soviet and American relationship a bit because now the Soviets are like, okay, so you're going to lie to our face after we just shot down your spy plane over our territory. So we're not going to deal on nation relationship here. We just need to be a little bit more covert with each other, is what we're getting. And this is going to lead into a sharp increase in antagonism between the United States and the Soviet Union going into 1961 and into the presidency of John F. Kennedy, which we know will ultimately culminate in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we will be discussing a little bit in the next video, which is the closest the two powers ever came to actual nuclear war. In the election of 1960, Eisenhower is obligated to two terms. He can't run for a third term because of the newly installed amendment that had blocked him. And he's term bound. He cannot run for a third, so he handpicks his successor. He picks his own vice president. He picks Richard Nixon to be basically that's who he'd like to have succeed him. Nixon does win the Republican nomination in 1960, but he then goes on to lose a very close election to Democratic Senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, who will actually win the White House that year. In his farewell address on January 17th of 1961, Eisenhower would warn Americans against the dangers of what he called the military-industrial complex. And this complex is what he said the threat was, that there was a threat of a partnership between the military establishment and big business that would threaten to control the course of American government if left unchecked. And he advised Americans to be wary of this and to avoid it at all costs. Of course, he said this during the height of the Cold War, and so at the time, his warnings kind of went unheeded. After leaving office on January 20th of 1961, Eisenhower would retire to a farm outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just right outside the Gettysburg battlefield from the Civil War. He would continue to support Republican candidates, including a reluctant endorsement of Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964. He would actually praise the election of his former Vice President Richard Nixon when he did win the presidential election in 1968. And on the day of Nixon's inauguration on January 20th of 69, Eisenhower had said that it was a day for rejoicing. Eisenhower, ironically, would die during his successor's presidency. He would die of congestive heart failure on March 28th of 1969 at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. at the age of 78. His state funeral was held in Capitol, and then his body was transported to burial in Abilene by funeral train, which was the last time until 2018 that a funeral train was used in a presidential funeral. Not until it would not be used again until the funeral of George H.W. Bush, which was just a couple years ago, not even 10 years ago. So here we have a picture of Eisenhower as president meeting with the South Vietnamese president, President Diem, in 1956. Diem would actually later be assassinated by this in a coup orchestrated by the CIA because he had been judged to be kind of a detriment to American interests in South Vietnam. And he was assassinated, I want to say, like a week or two before John F. Kennedy ended up getting assassinated. Here we have a map of the national system of the interstate highways as it looked in 1965, just within not even about 10 years of it starting under Eisenhower, of the many highways that were in place already then, and it's only expanded since. Here we have a picture of the Little Rock Nine, this the federal troops escorting them in 1957 to their high school of these African American students to ensure that they could actually be integrated into the public school that they were set to attend. See here. Here is a picture of President Eisenhower and his wife Mamie in 1955 during his presidency. And Mammy is actually credited with forming this what became the office of the first lady in terms of like getting her own staff and everything. The first lady did not used to have her own staff, and she's the one credited for getting the first lady kind of her own entourage and staff during her time in the White House. Then what else here? We have a picture of the Soviet satellite Sputnik, which it always emitted this constant beep noise that you could actually listen to. You could tune in on your radio with back then in the 1950s, and you could hear this thing as it went around the Earth, getting this beep. And to Americans, it was both fascinating and terrifying that the Soviets had this, floating satellite hovering over the United States. Like it wasn't hovering, but like it was going over it. And they didn't know if it was being used for spy purposes or not. It wasn't. But this is what that satellite looked like, not like today's satellites. It just looks like a metal ball with a couple of big antennas coming out of it. But it was the first man-made satellite to actually go into space. It eventually crashed back under Earth. I can't remember how long it stayed in orbit. And then here we have Eisenhower visiting the island of Taiwan during the Taiwan crisis in 1960 with President Chiang Kai-shek, who had been the former Chinese leader before the Communist Revolution. And then here we have him meeting with President-elect John F. Kennedy in December of 1960. So at this point, the election's over, and he's meeting his successor and inviting him to the White House. Looks like they're sharing a very cordial moment at that time. And then here we have an image of Eisenhower's funeral in Washington, D.C. in 1969. So that conclude, and then regarding this coin here, which has Eisenhower on it, this is actually a first year of this coin. So this is a 1971 one. That is actually the year this coin was first made. This design, it was called the Eisenhower dollar, and it was just a copper and nickel dollar clad dollar. It's one of the last large dollars we had. And Eisenhower was put on that. He had died just 2 years before this coin came out, so it was kind of a tribute to him. And on the back side, what's cool is kind of a tribute to, the space race kind of kicking off under Eisenhower. We have the American Eagle kind of landing on the moon because we have the Earth in the background, and then there's craters symbolizing the lunar surface where the eagle is, which at this time also would have been celebrating that 2 years prior to this, in the same year that Eisenhower died, the United States ended up winning the space race by setting the first two men on the moon, which the Soviets were never able to do. So that also kind of commemorates Eisenhower and at the same time commemorating the American victory in the space race. So I think that wraps up for President Eisenhower. So again, a very, I wouldn't say the most phenomenal president, but I would say definitely in the you know, upper tier of them. He was definitely one of the better ones that we've had. He was very good for his time. So, as I said during the video, I think maybe next week we may take a look at the Iranian Revolution, as I think that would be highly relevant to both what has been going on in recent weeks and at the same time connecting a little bit to Eisenhower a bit because his administration played a role in the overthrow of an Iranian government in 1953 that would contribute down the line to what ended up happening in 1979. So we'll possibly look into discussing that next week. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any, added information or anything like that, feel free to put it into the comment section and I'll be more than happy to go through it when I can. So hopefully everyone has a good 4th of July holiday, which is this weekend. Officially it's tomorrow, but going into the holiday weekend as a whole as the nation turns 249 years old. It's quite shocking to realize that just a year from now we'll be having the big 250th, which is, I hope, going to be a very good year for this country in terms of celebration. So hopefully we'll have a very good historical celebration going into next year for it. For what I heard, I believe that the government is set to release tomorrow, I believe, some of the uh, planned events that they're wanting to do for the big 250th anniversary next year. So maybe we'll get some more details on what's going to go on around the country tomorrow in terms of state government sponsored celebrations. Of course, local towns and states will do their own things as well. So we'll see what goes on there, hopefully tomorrow. So hopefully everyone has a good holiday weekend, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video.